Have you ever been truly alone, in a place so vast and silent that the only sound is the drumming of your own heartbeat against your ribs, and the only light is the narrow beam of your high beams cutting through an endless, suffocating darkness? Imagine miles of winding, unlit roads, bordered on both sides by trees so dense they swallow every hint of the sky, every distant whisper of civilization. That was my nightly office. This is the kind of story that makes you check your locks twice before going to bed. So, before the story truly begins, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as you listen, maybe take a moment to drop your city and local time in the comments below. Now, dim the lights, feel the air grow colder, and try to ignore the shadows dancing at the corner of your eye. Let's dive together into tonight's nightmare. For 2 years, my life revolved around the rhythm of the night. I worked for a specialized delivery service, handling sensitive or oversized packages that couldn't be shipped through conventional means during the day. Think antique furniture, rare art, sometimes even classified documents. My route, more often than not, took me far from the glow of city lights, deep into the rural stretches of the state, and sometimes into places that felt entirely off the map. Most of my colleagues dreaded these routes, but I found a strange peace in them. The solitude was a balm after a day of dealing with, well, people, and the night, in its vast, indifferent embrace, felt less judgmental than the glare of the sun. The isolation was a feature, not a bug, of the job. My vehicle was a standard cargo van, a Ford Transit, nothing fancy, but it was reliable. Its headlights were my constant companions, pushing back the encroaching darkness, revealing whatever stretch of asphalt lay ahead, always about 20 feet at a time. The hum of the engine, the low thrum of the tires on pavement, those were the only sounds for hours on end, apart from the occasional crackle of static from the two-way radio if dispatch needed to reach me. Most nights, they didn't. I was a ghost on wheels, a nocturnal courier traversing forgotten byways. This particular night started like any other. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and late autumn leaves. It was late October, and the chill was beginning to bite, a precursor to the real cold of winter. The sky, what little I could see of it through the gaps in the city lights, was a deep, inky black, scattered with pinprick stars. My current delivery was to a remote hunting lodge, or what the manifest described as a private wilderness retreat. It was located deep within the Blackwood Forest, an old-growth area known for its challenging terrain and almost complete lack of cell service. A place where even GPS could get a little unreliable. My final waypoint was marked as Old Miller's Road, a name that sounded like it belonged in a forgotten folktale. The initial part of the drive was familiar enough. I passed through small towns, their main streets already quiet, windows dark except for the glow of a solitary porch light or the blinking sign of a closed gas station. The further I drove, the more the signs of human habitation thinned out. The roadside diners gave way to endless fields, then those fields gave way to the encroaching darkness of the tree line. The real Blackwood Forest began abruptly, marked by an old, weather-beaten wooden sign that simply read, "Blackwood Forest Preserve, enter at your own risk." I always found that last part amusing, a quaint anachronism from a bygone era when roads were less maintained, and nature was perhaps more untamed. It was just a forest after all, a really big one. As I veered off the main highway onto Old Miller's Road, the vehicle's lights swallowed by the towering pines, the world outside the van became a blur of dark shapes and deeper shadows. The road itself narrowed considerably, transitioning from asphalt to packed gravel, then to what felt like little more than a dirt track, intermittently riddled with potholes and stretches of exposed roots. The trees here grew close, their branches interlacing overhead, forming a natural canopy that almost completely blocked out the moon and stars. It was like driving through a tunnel of impenetrable darkness, lit only by my own vehicle's insistent beams. I remember thinking how still it was. Usually, even deep in the woods, you'd hear something. the rustle of a small animal in the undergrowth, the hoot of an owl, the distant cry of a coyote. But tonight, there was nothing. No crickets, no rustling leaves, not even the faint whisper of wind through the branches. It was an unnatural quiet, the kind that presses in on you, making your ears strain for any sound, desperately seeking proof that the world outside still existed beyond your metal shell. My headlights cut through the solid wall of trees, illuminating brief fleeting sections of the forest floor, gnarled roots, moss-covered rocks, and the occasional burst of vibrant autumn leaves, now faded and muted by the stark beams. My mind, accustomed to the monotony of these drives, began to wander. I thought about the warmth of my small apartment, the comfortable silence, the simple pleasure of a hot cup of tea. It was a stark contrast to the cold, isolated world I currently inhabited. I adjusted the heater, pulling the collar of my jacket up higher. The cabin of the van, usually a familiar and comforting space, felt a little more exposed tonight, a little less secure. I blamed it on the unusual silence, or maybe it was just the sheer depth of the woods I was venturing into. The manifest had specified that the retreat was at the very end of Miller's Road, a phrase that seemed designed to fill any rational person with a mild sense of dread. I pressed on, the van rattling gently over the uneven terrain. The miles crawled by, each one seeming longer than the last. The deeper I went, the more the trees seemed to close in, leaning over the road as if trying to reclaim it. Occasionally, I'd catch a flicker in my peripheral vision, a movement just at the edge of the light. I'd glance over, but there would be nothing there, just the dark, impenetrable wall of trees. It was probably just the reflection of my own headlights on a patch of wet leaves, or a trick of the exhausted eye. Happens all the time on these long hauls. You start seeing things, imagining shapes in the shadows. It was just an element of ambiguity, a fleeting thought that something was there when logically it couldn't be. The turnoff to the hunting lodge was supposed to be marked by a large, ornate gate. I was well past the estimated arrival time, according to my earlier calculations, and still no gate. I checked the odometer against my paper map again. Had I missed it? Doubt began to creep in, a tiny, insidious worm. I slowed the van, peering intently into the darkness beyond the headlight beams. That's when I noticed an odd detail, something I hadn't seen on this road before, even though I'd passed through this general area once or twice. Off to the left, slightly uphill from the road, illuminated faintly by the spillover light from my van, was a single freshly painted wooden sign. It was simple, square, and unmarked. No words or symbols, just a stark, pristine white against the dark backdrop of the forest. It stood out because everything else out here was old, weathered, or naturally occurring. A brand new, blank sign in the middle of nowhere. It felt out of place, an odd grounding detail that anchored me to the strangeness of the environment. I remember thinking it was probably just a new survey marker or something easily explained. But then I saw it again. That flicker. This time, it wasn't at the edge of my vision. It was directly in front of me, far down the road, at the vanishing point where the tunnel of trees met the darkness. A tiny, almost imperceptible gleam. It wasn't a headlight or a house light. Too small, too low to the ground. It was like a pair of eyes, reflecting the distant spill of my own headlights. I blinked, rubbed my eyes. Nothing. It had to be a trick of the light, a dewdrop on a spiderweb, anything. The road ahead remained stubbornly dark, but the image lingered, a pair of pinpoint reflections that had disappeared as soon as I focused on them. This was my foreshadowing detail, a subtle hint that would later gain a truly sinister meaning. I accelerated cautiously, telling myself it was nothing but fatigue. The forest was just playing tricks on my tired mind. I had to deliver this package, and then I could go home, back to the comforting hum of my own quiet life. The silent, unblinking darkness of the forest pressed in, amplifying every creak of the van's suspension, every groan of the engine. My earlier reassurances about fatigue and tricks of light began to feel thin, stretched over a growing unease. The blank white sign had disturbed me more than I wanted to admit, an anomaly in a landscape that was defined by its ancient, untouched wildness. I kept driving, the van's headlights now seeming less like a protective bubble and more like a tunnel vision, limiting my awareness of anything beyond their narrow cone. The air in the cabin felt colder despite the heater. After what felt like another hour, the road finally opened up slightly. The trees receded a few feet, allowing a sliver of the actual night sky to show through, a thin crescent moon, barely piercing the veil of clouds. And there finally was the gate mentioned in my instructions. It wasn't ornate, not like I'd imagined. It was a rustic, heavy wooden gate, deeply weathered, almost swallowed by the overgrowth of vines and bushes. It certainly didn't look like an entrance to a retreat, more like a forgotten property line. A small, handcrafted sign was nailed to one of the thick posts, barely legible in the dim light. Blackwood Lodge private property. No lights, no bells. Just a simple, almost forlorn entrance. Following protocol, I pulled the van to a stop, engaged the parking brake, and killed the engine. The sudden silence was absolute, heavier and more profound than before. My ears, accustomed to the constant hum of the vehicle, now rang with the absence of sound. It was the kind of deep quiet that makes you feel utterly exposed, as if the very air around you is holding its breath. I reached for my heavy-duty flashlight, a maglite that could practically cut through steel, and clicked it on. Its powerful beam sliced through the darkness, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air of the cabin. Stepping out of the van, the cold hit me, sharper than I'd anticipated. It was a dry, biting cold, the kind that sinks into your bones. I immediately pulled my jacket tighter. The air outside smelled different here, too. Less damp earth, more pine needle and something else, something subtly animalistic. Maybe deer or some other forest creature. A faint, earthy musk. I aimed the flashlight at the gate. It was secured with a heavy chain and padlock. My instructions included a combination. I fumbled for my paperwork, the beam of the flashlight dancing over the crumpled sheet. My fingers were stiff with the cold. As I worked the combination lock, which groaned in protest as it finally yielded, I became acutely aware of the sounds of the forest, or rather the lack thereof. Still nothing. No crickets, no rustling, no distant calls. The unnatural quiet was beginning to truly unnerve me. My breath plumed white in the frigid air as I swung the heavy gate open, its rusty hinges protesting with a drawn-out metallic shriek that seemed to echo endlessly through the silent trees. The sound was so loud in the stillness, it made me flinch. I felt an irrational urge to apologize to the forest for disturbing its peace. I backed the van up, pulled it through the gate, then got out again to close and lock it behind me. This was standard procedure. You don't leave a heavy load exposed out here. As I was securing the chain, my flashlight beam swung across the immediate periphery of the gate. That's when I saw it, or rather felt it. A flicker of movement just at the edge of the light deep within the trees, perhaps 50 yards off. It was too quick to make out any detail, just a fleeting shadow, a displacement in the absolute darkness. My heart gave a little jolt. I immediately swung the maglite over, focusing on the spot. Nothing, just the dark, tightly packed trees, their shadows stretching long and distorted in the beam. I told myself it was just an animal. A deer, a fox, something startled by the gate's screech, but a deer would likely freeze or bolt with a crash through the undergrowth. This was quieter, more ephemeral. I stood there for a moment longer, flashlight held steady, straining my ears. Still nothing. The silence was unbroken. It felt like the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting. My uneasiness solidified into something more concrete, a prickle of unease on the back of my neck. I hurried back to the van, clambering inside, and starting the engine with a little more urgency than strictly necessary. The drive from the gate to the lodge was a short, winding path, barely wider than the van itself. The trees here were even thicker, ancient sentinels that seemed to lean in, their branches clawing at the vehicle's sides. The path was overgrown, suggesting it wasn't used frequently. I wondered what kind of people would choose to hole up in a place this remote. As I rounded a particularly tight bend, the lodge finally appeared through the trees. It wasn't a lodge in the traditional sense. It was a sprawling, dark structure, built from rough-hewn logs and local stone, nestled into a small clearing. No lights were visible inside, which struck me as odd. You'd think someone expecting a delivery in the middle of the night would at least leave a porch light on. The building itself looked less like a cozy retreat and more like an imposing fortress against the wilderness. A few scattered, unkempt evergreen bushes grew close to the foundation, their shadows deep and menacing in the van's headlights. I parked the van as close to the main entrance as I could, killed the engine, and pulled the emergency brake. This time, when the engine died, the silence wasn't quite as absolute. Faintly, so faint I almost dismissed it as my imagination. I heard it, a rustle, not the normal rustle of wind through leaves or a small animal scampering. This was heavier, more deliberate, like something dragging itself over dry leaves just outside the immediate perimeter of the clearing. It came from the direction of the gate, from the path I had just driven up. I switched off the van's interior light, plunging the cabin into near total darkness, and peered intently through the windshield. The only illumination came from the sliver of moon struggling to break through the clouds. My eyes strained, trying to pierce the gloom. Nothing, just the dark shapes of the trees, their upper branches swaying almost imperceptibly in a breeze I couldn't feel. Was it the wind? But I hadn't felt any wind. The air had been utterly still. This was another element of ambiguity, a moment where I questioned if my senses were playing tricks on me in the isolated, dark environment. Then I heard it again, closer this time. Definitely a rustling, a dragging sound, followed by what sounded like a branch snapping. Not a twig, a branch, too heavy for a deer, too slow for anything truly fleeing. My heart began to pound a little harder. This wasn't just a trick of the light or an overactive imagination anymore. There was something out there, something moving through the woods towards the clearing. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white. A strange primal instinct screamed at me to just put the van in gear and drive, but where? I was in the middle of nowhere, miles from the nearest paved road. I told myself it was a bear, or a large, nocturnal animal. But bears usually make more noise, especially if they're moving through dense undergrowth. This was too quiet, too deliberate. My flashlight was still clutched in my hand. I thought about shining it out into the darkness, but something held me back. A terrifying thought, a sudden chilling realization that if I shone the light, I might see something I absolutely did not want to see. Maybe the best thing to do was to remain still, remain unseen. If it was just an animal, it would pass. But then the rustling stopped, the branch snapping, the dragging sound, all gone. The silence descended once more, but this time it was pregnant with a new, terrifying weight. It felt as though whatever was out there had stopped too. And it was listening. The silence that followed felt thicker, heavier than any I had experienced before. It wasn't merely the absence of sound. It was a profound, suffocating stillness that seemed to absorb every potential noise, even the whisper of my own breath. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drum in the confines of the van. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to move, to do something, but I was frozen, paralyzed by the chilling conviction that whatever was out there was now aware of my presence. My eyes, still straining against the almost absolute darkness beyond the headlight's reach, tried to discern any movement, any shape. But there was nothing, only the black, featureless wall of trees. I must have sat there for 5 minutes, maybe 10, though it felt like an eternity. Each second stretched, taut and agonizing, pregnant with the expectation of some terrifying revelation. The air in the van grew stale, heavy with my own fear. I tried to reason with myself. It was an animal, of course, just an animal. Maybe it had heard me, stopped, and was now just being still. But what kind of animal moves so quietly, yet audibly, and then simply ceases all sound? A predator, perhaps, one that listens before it strikes. The thought sent a fresh wave of dread through me. Eventually, the pressure of the silence became unbearable. I couldn't just sit there, waiting for something unseen to emerge. I had a delivery to make. Procrastinating wouldn't make whatever was out there disappear. With a deep, shaky breath, I decided to act. I had to assume it was an animal, and that if I kept to my routine, it would eventually move on. I gripped my heavy maglite, its cool metal a small comfort in my clammy hand. My legs felt like lead as I pushed open the van door, the inevitable creak sounding like a gunshot in the oppressive stillness. Stepping out, I kept the maglite beam pointed downwards, illuminating the ground directly in front of me, not daring to sweep it into the darkness. I needed to focus on the task. The air was still bitingly cold, and the smell of pine and damp earth was stronger now, mixed with that faint, musky scent I still couldn't identify. I walked quickly to the back of the van, my senses on high alert, every muscle tensed. The cargo bay doors were heavy, and opening them required a bit of muscle. The hinges groaned, echoing that dreadful gate's shriek, a sound that made me wince and instinctively glance over my shoulder. Nothing. The package was surprisingly light for its size, a large wooden crate roughly 5 feet by 3, but hollow sounding when I shifted it. It was clearly marked, fragile top secret contents. I always found such labels a bit theatrical, but I wasn't paid to ask questions. Getting it out of the van and onto the attached hand truck was quick work. The wheels of the hand truck squeaked softly as I pulled it towards the lodge's main entrance. As I approached the heavy, dark wooden door, I noticed a small, almost invisible doorbell to the side. I pressed it, no chime, no sound at all, just a soft click that felt strangely hollow. I waited for a moment, then pressed it again, holding my finger down. Still nothing. No lights came on inside, no sound of movement. It was as if the lodge was completely deserted. This was highly unusual. Every delivery I'd ever made to a remote location had involved someone waiting, or at least a visible sign of life. A light, a dog barking, anything. This was another grounding detail that felt subtly wrong, shifting my perception of the normal. I checked my instructions again. Deliver to main entrance. Client will retrieve package. No mention of knocking or waiting for a response. Just deliver, I frowned. This whole setup was just off. My unease intensified. I decided to leave the package by the door. It wasn't ideal, but I wasn't going to stand around waiting in the middle of this silent, dark clearing. As I bent down to place the crate against the doorframe, my ear caught something, a faint sound, a low, guttural murmur. It wasn't human. It wasn't animalistic in any way I recognized. It was a sound that seemed to vibrate in the very air, deep and resonant, almost like a very low-frequency growl or hum. It seemed to come from the surrounding tree line, perhaps 50 yards behind me, near the spot where I'd heard the initial rustling. My blood ran cold. I immediately stood upright, spinning around, maglite beam sweeping wildly into the darkness. The light caught nothing but trunks and branches, a chaotic, swirling mess of shadows. My breath hitched in my throat. I couldn't place the sound. It wasn't loud, but it had an undeniable presence, a palpable weight that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. The sound was too deep for a coyote, too low for a bear. And it wasn't a mechanical hum, not like any engine I knew. This was organic, and it felt like it was coming from something massive. My mind struggled to process it, to rationalize it, but there was no rational explanation for a sound like that. I stood there frozen again, listening, my heart hammering against my ribs, threatening to burst. The low hum, or growl, whatever it was, continued for a few agonizing seconds, then slowly, almost imperceptibly, faded back into the profound silence from which it had emerged. It was as if the forest was merely breathing, a deep, slow exhalation of something ancient and terrible. I forced myself to be rational. Perhaps it was some kind of strange wind phenomenon, or the lodge's ancient pipes groaning in the night. An element of ambiguity, a desperate attempt to explain away the inexplicable. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. My instinct to flee suddenly became overwhelming. I didn't care about protocol, didn't care about anything but getting back into that van and driving away from this place. I practically ran back to the vehicle, fumbling with the cargo doors to slam them shut. The sound of the latch clicking into place was a small reassurance, but it felt flimsy, easily breached. I scrambled into the driver's seat, threw the hand truck into the back, and slammed my door shut with a solid thud. My hands trembled violently as I shoved the key into the ignition. My fingers felt numb, clumsy. I turned the key. The engine coughed, sputtered. It didn't start. A wave of pure, unadulterated panic washed over me. I tried again, turning the key, holding it. The starter motor whirred weakly, a pathetic, dying sound. The engine refused to catch. My mind raced, trying to think of a logical reason. It was cold, yes, but the van was well maintained. It had never failed me before. Not like this. Not here. Not now. The silence outside seemed to press in even closer, no longer just quiet, but actively predatory, waiting for me to make a mistake. And then I heard it again, a distinct, heavy thud. It came from the passenger side, very close. So close it seemed to vibrate through the very chassis of the van, like something large, heavy, and soft had just landed on the roof. My eyes were wide, staring straight ahead into the darkness. I didn't dare turn my head. Every fiber of my being screamed at me not to look, but I could feel it, the weight, the vibration. And then a low, dragging sound, like something enormous was slowly pulling itself across the roof of the van, settling in. This was my foreshadowing detail manifesting into something undeniably real. My breath caught in my throat. I could feel the roof of the van subtly depress under the weight, a slight creak of metal. It was there. Whatever it was on the van. The raw, primal terror that surged through me was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It wasn't just fear. It was a profound, instinctual dread that bypassed all rational thought. I was trapped. The van, usually my sanctuary on these long, lonely drives, had become a metal coffin, and something immense and unseen was directly above me. I could feel its weight, the subtle deformation of the roof, the faint creak of the stressed metal. The air inside the cabin became impossibly cold, despite the heater being on. My entire body locked up, rigid with terror, my hands still clutched on the ignition key, refusing to let go. The dragging sound continued for a few agonizing seconds, a slow, deliberate movement across the roof, ending with a soft, heavy thud directly above the windshield. It wasn't the scramble of an animal or the clumsy fall of a branch. This was controlled, purposeful. Then silence again, but this silence was different. It was a listening silence, the kind that indicates an apex predator has found its mark and is now assessing, planning its next move. I could almost feel its presence, a tangible weight of malevolence pressing down on the van, on me. I squeezed my eyes shut for a moment, trying to reassert some semblance of control, to force my racing mind back to reality. This couldn't be happening. It had to be a nightmare, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and the isolation of the forest. But the cold, the subtle creaking, the undeniable sense of a massive, living thing just inches above my head, it was terrifyingly real. My breath hitched, a harsh, ragged sound in the absolute stillness. With a monumental effort, I forced my eyes open, staring straight ahead through the windshield, not daring to look up, not daring to even glance at the rearview mirror. The glass was dark, reflecting only the faint interior of the van. The trees outside were a solid, impenetrable wall of black. My mind screamed at me to start the engine to escape, but terror had rendered me useless. My hands were still shaking uncontrollably. Then a new sound, a soft scraping noise. It came from directly above the windshield, just on the other side of the glass, like thick, leathery fingers slowly, deliberately being dragged across the metal, pushing against it, leaving thin, almost invisible streaks in the condensation. I heard it, I felt it, and the very idea of what could be making that sound was enough to make me want to vomit. It was moving slowly, around the front of the van, obscuring my view, inch by agonizing inch. And then a shape began to form, a dark shape, impossibly large, slowly lowering itself into my field of vision, just above the hood. It was indistinct at first, a deeper shadow against the already profound darkness of the night. But as it descended further, as it came into the faint spill of light from the van's interior, I saw it. Two eyes. Not animal eyes, not the reflective gleam I had seen earlier. These were large, dark, and utterly devoid of pupils, like polished obsidian. They were set widely apart on a head that was indistinct, almost camouflaged against the night, but clearly massive. They weren't reflecting my headlights. They were absorbing them, drinking them in, and they were staring directly at me. Unblinkingly, I couldn't breathe. My lungs had simply forgotten how. The terror was so intense that it felt physical, like an unbearable weight pressing down on my chest. The shape continued to descend slowly, until its face was fully visible just above the hood, mere feet from my windshield. It was roughly humanoid in general outline, but horribly distorted, elongated, and impossibly thin. Its skin, if it was skin, was a mottled, bark-like texture, dark and rough, blending perfectly with the surrounding trees. Its limbs, which I could only infer, seemed long and spindly, ending in what looked like oversized, clawed hands that were now pressing against the hood, the metal visibly indenting under the pressure. It had no discernible nose or mouth, just those two cavernous, unblinking black eyes that stared into my soul. A faint, earthy, almost rotten smell clung to the air outside, seeping faintly into the van. A smell of damp soil and something ancient that had been buried for too long. This was a grounding detail that cemented the horrifying reality of the encounter. This thing wasn't just a shadow or a sound. It had a physical presence, a terrible, tangible smell. My mind shattered, unable to reconcile this monstrous impossibility with anything I knew. This wasn't a bear or a coyote or any creature from Earth. This was something from a nightmare, something ancient and malevolent, something that belonged to the darkest, forgotten corners of the Blackwood Forest. An element of ambiguity that would haunt me for years. Was I truly seeing this? Was it a hallucination brought on by extreme fear, or was this creature truly real, a denizen of the deep woods? My survival instinct, dormant for too long, finally roared to life. I had to get away, now, or I would die here, swallowed by the silent, judging darkness of the forest. My hands, though still shaking, moved with a newfound frantic energy. I slammed the key into the ignition again, twisted it with desperate force, holding it. The starter motor whirred, sounding a little stronger this time. I pumped the gas pedal frantically, my foot trembling. The creature on the hood remained motionless, its dark eyes fixed on me, a silent, predatory gaze. It was simply watching, waiting. It almost seemed to be enjoying my fear. This was my foreshadowing detail realized. Those pinpoint reflections in the distance were just an early warning, a mere flirtation with the true terror that now faced me. The engine coughed, sputtered, again. And then miraculously, with a loud, protesting roar, it caught. The van vibrated violently, the sound of the engine a deafening symphony of hope. I didn't hesitate. I slammed the shifter into reverse, stomped on the gas pedal. The tires spun, spraying gravel, then bit into the dirt. The van lurched backward, throwing me against the seat. I didn't care. I didn't even look in the rearview mirror. I just needed to move. As the van jerked backward, I felt a violent thud on the roof, a jarring impact that shook the entire vehicle. The creature, whatever it was, had clearly not been dislodged. It was still there, clinging to the top of my van. I heard a sickening scrape, like enormous claws digging into the metal, the sound of tearing metal. It was trying to hold on. A shiver of pure revulsion went through me. I kept the gas pedal floored, twisting the steering wheel, trying to turn the van around in the small clearing. The trees were too close, the turning radius too wide. I had to go in reverse, back down the winding, narrow path I had just come up. The van careened wildly, bouncing over roots and potholes, my head slamming against the headrest. I could hear the scraping on the roof, a relentless, grating sound that clawed at my sanity. It was still there. I risked a quick glance in the rearview mirror. Nothing. The roof of the van was too high to see anything directly behind me, but I knew it was there. I could feel its presence, a heavy, malevolent weight. I could almost hear it breathing, a raspy, shallow sound that seemed to vibrate through the very air. Or maybe that was just my own terrified wheezing. The turn to the main gate was approaching. I needed to get the van turned around. I couldn't drive backwards for miles down that winding, pitch-black road. It was too risky. I saw a slightly wider patch of road ahead just before the trees closed in again. I would try to maneuver a three-point turn there. My hands were slick with sweat on the steering wheel, my body trembling with a mixture of adrenaline and bone-deep fear. This was no longer a delivery route. This was a desperate flight for my life. The engine roared, the van bucked and swayed, and the sickening scrape on the roof filled the cabin, a constant, grating reminder that my pursuer was still very much with me. My entire world had narrowed to the twin beams of my headlights cutting through the absolute darkness, and the agonizing calculation of how to turn this metal coffin around. The path was barely wide enough for the van, and every attempt at a three-point turn felt like trying to maneuver a battleship in a bathtub. I was hyper-aware of every branch striking the side of the van, every stone crunching under the tires, and most terrifyingly, the rhythmic thud and scrape directly above my head. It was still up there, clinging. I slammed the shifter into drive, then reverse, then drive again, my foot alternating between the gas and brake, my movements jerky and desperate. The tires spun, spraying dirt and small stones. The van groaned under the strain, its engine protesting, but it moved inch by agonizing inch, slowly turning its nose towards the direction of the main gate. On one particularly violent lurch, I felt a more pronounced shift on the roof, a heavy settling, and then a distinct crack from above the passenger side, as if something had snapped or torn. I didn't dare look. I just gritted my teeth and concentrated on the road, or what passed for it. Finally, after what felt like an eternity but was probably only a minute or two of frantic maneuvering, the van was pointed in the right direction. Forward, towards the gate, towards the distant promise of the highway. I floored the accelerator, not caring about the potholes or the rough terrain. The van surged forward with a desperate urgency, its suspension groaning, every panel rattling. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white and aching. My mouth was dry, my throat constricted. The creature on the roof seemed to respond to the increased speed. The scraping became more frantic, a frantic scrabbling on the metal, punctuated by heavy thumps as it shifted its weight, no doubt digging its talons deeper into the roof. I could almost feel its struggles through the chassis, a living, tangible weight trying to maintain its purchase. I pushed the van faster, hoping the sheer velocity, the jarring bounces, would somehow dislodge it. Each bump was a prayer, each jolt a desperate plea. The narrow, winding dirt track was a blur in my headlights. Trees flashed past, their dark shapes coalescing into an endless, terrifying tunnel. I kept my eyes fixed straight ahead, refusing to look in the rearview mirror, refusing to acknowledge the impossible thing that rode with me. But I could hear it, and I could feel it. The subtle shift in balance, the almost imperceptible changes in the van's handling, all spoke to a massive, non-aerodynamic weight on the roof. Then the scraping intensified, becoming a tearing sound, a dreadful ripping of metal. I flinched, instinctively ducking my head even though it made no difference. The sound grew louder, more insistent. It was trying to get in, or it was just holding on with a desperate, destructive grip. I didn't know which was worse. I knew the roof of a cargo van wasn't designed for whatever immense weight was currently clinging to it. The metal was giving way. This was a painful grounding detail, the tangible destruction of my vehicle serving as proof that this horror was not a delusion. As I rounded another sharp bend, the van tilted precariously on two wheels for a terrifying second before slamming back down. The jolt was violent. Immediately after, the grating, tearing sound on the roof changed. It became a frantic, desperate thrashing, accompanied by what sounded like a low, guttural shriek, a sound of pure rage and frustration that vibrated through the very air. It was falling. I didn't look, couldn't look. I just pressed the accelerator harder, pushing the van to its absolute limit, the engine screaming in protest. I heard a heavy thump behind me, somewhere on the road, followed by a sickening crunching sound. The van felt lighter suddenly, as if an enormous burden had been lifted. The air in the cabin, though still cold, felt less oppressive. It was off. Whatever it was no longer on the roof, but I wasn't safe. Not yet. I knew this forest, knew the speed and impossible silence with which that thing had moved. It wouldn't simply give up. I kept driving, my eyes darting from the road to the rearview mirror, even though the darkness was too profound to see anything but the fleeting shapes of the trees. The fear, though lessened, was still a cold knot in my stomach. I was hyper-aware of everything around me now, every shadow, every rustle. My earlier attempts at rationalization, my elements of ambiguity, had shattered under the undeniable physical evidence of this creature. This was real. The main gate finally appeared in my headlights, looming out of the darkness. It was still partly open from when I'd driven through. I didn't slow down. I aimed the van directly for the gap, hoping it was wide enough. I wasn't going to stop to close it. Not now, not ever again. As the van barreled through the gate, the rusted hinges creaked their protest one last time, a mournful sound that echoed my own despair. Once past the gate, the road still remained dark and winding, but I knew it would eventually lead back to the main highway. I didn't dare slow down, didn't dare look back. My eyes were fixed on the asphalt ahead, every nerve screaming at me to go faster. I felt a strange combination of exultation and bone-deep fatigue. I had escaped, but the image of those black, unblinking eyes, the feel of that massive weight on the roof, the sound of tearing metal, it was all burned into my mind. As I drove, the terrain slowly began to change. The trees, though still dense, seemed less claustrophobic, their branches not quite as low. The road itself gradually widened, the gravel giving way to a rough, broken asphalt, then to a slightly better maintained stretch. And then far ahead, a faint, diffuse glow appeared on the horizon, the blessed, glorious light of the highway. It was like seeing a sunrise after an endless, terrifying night. But even as the highway lights grew brighter and the first distant hum of traffic reached my ears, I couldn't shake the feeling. The sheer, overwhelming silence of the Blackwood forest still clung to the van, like an invisible shroud. It was almost as if the creature had marked me, or perhaps simply left a piece of itself behind in the terrified echo of my own mind. My final foreshadowing detail had become an enduring nightmare. I had escaped the immediate threat, but the forest and whatever lived within its deepest shadows had left an indelible mark. I glanced at the dashboard clock. It was nearly 4 a.m. The sun would be rising soon. A new day, but for me, the darkness had just begun. As the van finally merged onto the main highway, the contrast was jarring. The constant, rhythmic hum of other vehicles, the bright, impersonal glow of streetlights and neon signs, even the subtle sway of the vehicle on smooth pavement, it all felt alien, almost offensive after the profound, predatory silence of the Blackwood forest. My body was still thrumming with adrenaline, a fierce tremor that ran through my hands and legs. I felt like a live wire, dangerously close to snapping. I drove for what felt like hours, even though it was probably only 30 minutes before I finally felt safe enough to pull over. I spotted a 24-hour gas station, a brightly lit beacon of fluorescent normalcy. I pulled the van over to the furthest reaches of the parking lot, away from the other cars, and killed the engine. The silence was still there, a ringing in my ears, but this time it was the relative quiet of a deserted corner of a gas station, not the oppressive, watchful silence of the woods. I just sat there for a long moment, gripping the steering wheel, my face buried in my hands. My breath came in ragged gasps. My mind replayed the events, trying to make sense of the impossible. The unblinking black eyes, the scraping on the roof, the heavy thud as it fell. It was all too vivid, too tactile to be a dream. And then the smell, that faint, earthy, rotten scent. It still lingered in the van, a ghost of its presence. That was a grounding detail that anchored the experience in a horrifying reality. With a monumental effort, I forced myself to move. I had to see the damage. I had to confirm what I knew deep down had happened. My legs felt like jelly as I pushed open the door and stepped out. The harsh glare of the parking lot lights felt painfully bright after hours in the dark. I walked around to the passenger side of the van, my eyes immediately drawn to the roof. What I saw made my stomach clench. The roof of the cargo van was severely damaged. Long, deep gouges marred the metal, as if something with enormous claws had dragged itself across the surface. Near the windshield, where I had felt the initial impact, the metal was not just scratched, but deeply indented, as if a massive weight had pressed down on it. And on the passenger side, directly above where I had heard that sickening crack, there was a ragged, jagged tear in the metal, roughly 2 feet long, as if something had violently ripped its way through. The edges were sharp, curled outwards, exposing the insulation inside. It wasn't just dents, it was active destruction. Proof. Undeniable, terrifying proof. I ran my hand over the jagged tear, my fingers trembling. The cold night air seeped through the hole. There was no way to explain this with a fallen branch or an animal. This was the work of something with immense strength and destructive intent. The extent of the damage was an element of ambiguity in itself. Why didn't it try harder to get in? Why did it cling to the roof? Was it playing with me? Or was it simply unable to breach the van completely? The questions swirled in my mind, each one more terrifying than the last. I slowly circled the van, checking the rest of it. The sides were scraped and scratched from the close encounter with the trees, but thankfully, there were no other signs of the creature's direct presence. Just the roof, and the lingering, faint smell that I still couldn't shake. I knew then that my life, the quiet solitude I had once found so comforting, was irrevocably changed. I tried to call dispatch, but my voice was a raspy whisper. I had to clear my throat several times before I could even begin to explain. I told them I'd hit a deer, a large one, and that the van was severely damaged. I couldn't bring myself to tell them the truth. Who would believe me? They'd think I was crazy, exhausted, or both. They arranged for a tow truck and a replacement vehicle, no questions asked. I was a reliable employee. They probably just assumed it was a standard accident, another hazard of the night shift. Waiting for the tow truck felt like another eternity. I stayed in the van, huddled in the driver's seat, staring out at the empty parking lot, jumping at every shadow, every distant sound. The sun finally began to rise, painting the eastern sky with hues of orange and pink, a beautiful, indifferent display that did nothing to alleviate the darkness in my soul. Sunlight, I had always thought, was a cure for fear, but this time it felt like a spotlight, exposing my vulnerability, making me feel even more exposed. I never went back to that route, never drove through the Blackwood Forest again. I asked for a transfer, citing personal reasons and burnout. They granted it without argument. I now work day shifts, mostly in the city. The noise, the crowds, the constant presence of other people, it's a jarring contrast to my old life, but it's also a shield. A fragile, comforting barrier against the things that lurk in the quiet. But the fear never truly left me. It burrowed deep into the very marrow of my bones. Every time I hear a faint scraping sound at night, or a subtle creak in the old house I live in, my heart leaps into my throat. Every shadow feels like a potential hiding place. The profound silence of a truly dark night, the kind I used to find so peaceful, now fills me with an icy dread. I sleep with lights on, or at least a nightlight. I check my locks multiple times. I jump at my own reflection in the dark. And sometimes, when I'm alone in my apartment in the deep hours of the night, if the /C unit hums just right, or the house settles with a groan, I swear I can still hear it. That low, guttural murmur, vibrating in the very air, deep and resonant. And I remember those two black, unblinking eyes, staring at me from the darkness, promising a horror that was beyond human comprehension. My final foreshadowing detail had become an enduring nightmare. I had escaped the immediate threat, but the forest, and whatever lived within its deepest shadows, had left an indelible mark. I occasionally still catch that faint, rotten earth smell, even when there's nothing around to explain it. It's a phantom scent, a reminder. The Blackwood Forest is still out there, its ancient trees guarding secrets far older and more terrifying than any human mind can comprehend. And I know with an absolute certainty that chills me to my core that whatever was out there, whatever followed me that night, is still there, waiting, patrolling its dark domain. And sometimes, when the wind whispers just right through the leaves, I wonder if it's listening. For me, the silence that now falls in my apartment is a different beast entirely from the one I once sought in the deep woods. It's not a comforting quiet, but a watchful hush, heavy with the weight of things unseen. I find myself listening, always listening, to the shifting timbers of the old house, the distant murmur of traffic that used to be a lullaby. Every unidentifiable creak, every subtle groan from the floorboards sends a jolt of ice through my veins. My mind, once an eager wanderer through the quiet dark, now races with phantom sounds and impossible shapes. The image of those eyes, they never truly left. They are burned into the back of my eyelids, appearing whenever the world goes dark, an unblinking, predatory gaze that seems to pierce through walls, through distance, through the very fabric of my fragile peace. I often wonder what it was, that thing in the Blackwood Forest, an unknown species, a creature of legend come to terrifying life, or something far older, something that predates humanity, a relic of a time when the world was raw and untamed and full of true monsters. The questions have no answers, and that absence of knowledge is perhaps the most terrifying part of all. It leaves too much room for speculation, too much space for the mind to fill with worst-case scenarios. I check my locks twice, sometimes 3 times before going to bed. The curtains are always drawn, heavy and impenetrable. The shadows in the corners of my room seem deeper now, more alive. I know, logically, that a short-range delivery driver should be safe within the confines of a city apartment, miles from that ancient forest. But logic and fear have rarely been good companions. The forest itself feels like a living entity now, vast and indifferent, yet somehow still connected to me through that terrifying night. And sometimes, late at night, when the light from the street lamp outside casts long, skeletal shadows on my wall, I can almost feel its gaze. Still watching, still waiting.